Final Fantasy VII, a game that some regard as the best Final Fantasy. Some may even credit its success as to why the new contender, the Sony PlayStation, defeated the veteran Nintendo in the console wars. But history might have played out very differently if Final Fantasy VII stuck to its original intended platform, the Nintendo 64. While the PlayStation brand is nowadays heavily tied to the mainline Final Fantasy brand, as a sort of poster child, back in the mid-90s, Final Fantasy was very much seen as a Nintendo series, with Final Fantasy 1 to 6 all appearing on Nintendo platforms exclusively up to then. So a sudden move to the PlayStation sent shocks and ripples through the gaming world back then. But this wasn't always the case, as the game was heavily attempted for the N64 before the move. What happened that led to Nintendo losing such a crucial game to newcomer Sony? Today on Gaming History, we explore how Nintendo almost got and lost Final Fantasy VII. Chapter 1. The creation of the 7th Fantasy. Final Fantasy VI had just released in 1994 worldwide exclusively on the Super Nintendo, a game that the creator of Final Fantasy, Hironobu Sakaguchi, considered as the greatest game in the universe. However, despite that, while the game was a commercial success in Japan, it was not so much in the West. But this was normal at the time, as many RPGs in the West had minimal success, with gaming being rather limited to a select audience of children and teenagers that weren't so much into text-heavy RPGs, and the market was also not so mainstream yet. However, the developers at Squaresoft sought to continue on and make the next game in the series, Final Fantasy VII. Being that it was 1994, the Super Nintendo still had some life left within it, and so the target platform was clear for Squaresoft, with the first 6 entries finding modest to outstanding success on these Nintendo platforms. The 7th Fantasy was to also be another entry for it. As such, plans started out for Final Fantasy VII as yet another 2D entry and went as far as to even develop a 2D prototype too, but eventually development was put on hold as Sakaguchi and the team went on to finish Chrono Trigger on the SNES. At this point, it was now 1995 and the next generation of consoles were either released or coming out soon. Nintendo in this case was starting to push the idea of their new console, the Ultra 64, to the public and many of its third-party partner developers in order to start developing games. For Sakaguchi and the team, this was a big step for them to make. They had already been comfortable with the 2D prototype, so they made a strategy on either continuing on and getting the game done in a timely manner versus the idea of basically restarting development and following the trend that everyone else was by going fully 3D. The decision was clear: take the riskier 3D path on a next generation console. Chapter 2. Making it work with the N64. The Nintendo 64 was the clear option for Final Fantasy VII, with both Squaresoft's clear good ties with Nintendo and how their game had shared modest success, even if not so much in the West. Their plan was to make a Final Fantasy game that would truly be a leap into the third dimension, with everything from massive maps to well put together cutscenes. And so Sakaguchi and the team decided to run some tests using machines they bought from Silicon Graphics Inc., the very corporation that was developing the GPU for the N64. An excellent test to see how the game would function on the N64 graphics before full development can begin. This test utilized Final Fantasy VI characters in a battle against a golem. One of Sakaguchi's biggest fears by going 3D was how unsure he was at what 3D battles would look like. This test showed how cinematic and well put together battles can be in the third dimension, despite it being turn-based combat. And so this tech demo was later shown in 1995 at the annual SIGGRAPH conference in Los Angeles, labeled as Final Fantasy VI, the interactive CG game. Of course, media outlets blew this tech demo to huge proportions. Magazines such as GameFan literally labeled it as actual screenshots of a game currently in development for Nintendo's Ultra 64, despite it being Final Fantasy VI characters on screen, a trend that would plague Final Fantasy VII again many years down the road. However, while the tech demo was very well received, when the team sat down to actually make the game on the N64 hardware, a string of problems were soon realized. Real-time tests began to see how well the N64 could achieve their plans for this gargantuan game. One thing Final Fantasy VII is well known for is the drastic shift from simple low-poly overworld models on a pre-rendered background to battles featuring high poly models duking it out with a cinematic camera. During this test, this very transition to high poly models was just simply not working out, as the N64 had difficulty rendering these models at an acceptable frame rate, especially with the enemy monster, the Behemoth, that featured 2,000 polygons on it alone. However, the other major problem was the cart size. Being that this is an RPG, it would be a big game in comparison to the N64's planned games that were mainly platformers or adventure games. A regular N64 cartridge at launch could provide between 4 to 12 megabytes of space, a very small amount for a game of this caliber. However, Nintendo was also making an add-on for the N64 called the 64 Disk Drive. This would let developers make games on 64 megabyte magnetic discs. A lot better than the regular size, but it was still nowhere near enough for what Squaresoft wished to make, as they also wished to feature many pre-rendered backgrounds and FMV cutscenes that would drastically increase the size of the game on top of the long game they were planning. In fact, Squaresoft believed they would require well over 30 magnetic discs to achieve what was just 2 PlayStation discs worth of content. The team was between a rock and a hard place of somehow making this dream game on this limited machine, especially since they had their relationship with Nintendo at jeopardy otherwise. However, while in this hard spot, an unlikely friendly face showed up with open arms to this company with a deal they couldn't refuse.
Hi, how are you?
If you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell to support us and keep creating new videos. Chapter 3. All aboard the PlayStation. With a new console on the market, Nintendo had another competitor on the market too, the Sony PlayStation. Sony had been working hard for the past few years on gathering many major and minor third-party studios to make games for their platform in order to not be another failed console like many before them, while also providing said third-party with a safe haven free from tough constraints put on them by first-party developers, namely Nintendo, and providing a powerful enough machine that runs on high-capacity discs to make whatever game they wish. During 1995, Squaresoft was in a jam with how they could make their dream game, Final Fantasy VII, a reality with N64's tough limitations. The team was at this point considering other consoles, as virtually anything else of that generation had proper disk space, whether it be Sega's new Saturn system, or even the idea of making Final Fantasy VII a PC game altogether. But soon, amongst Sony's contact to third-party developers, they visited Squaresoft and offered to work with them in making their game for their PlayStation console. Intrigued with this proposition, Squaresoft and the team put together some tests on the Sony PlayStation, handling both the disk capacity needed, even if disk switching was required, and even handling those high polygonal models for battles without a drop in frame rate. The decision was very clear for the team. While executives saw eye to eye with Sakaguchi and his team, a major hurdle was still ahead of them, facing Nintendo to tell them this awful news. And so, Hironobu Sakaguchi, the president of Squaresoft Masafumi Miyamoto, and lead programmer Ken Narita set up a meeting with the infamous iron-fisted president of Nintendo, Hiroshi Yamauchi. Hiroshi Yamauchi was well known to third-party developers as basically a tyrant who had placed many restrictions on them on what they can develop, how much they can develop, and even who can sell their games. So as such, when the trio met with Yamauchi, who greeted them very warmly with an expensive bento meal and beer, that is when they broke the news to him that Final Fantasy VII was now being made for the Sony PlayStation. Yamauchi stayed professional to this revelation and simply wished them the best with their endeavors. To Sakaguchi, the meeting went better than expected, as no bitter feelings were exchanged. But in reality, Nintendo was rather furious. In fact, it went as far as Nintendo making more or less passive-aggressive remarks to Squaresoft, stating, "Oh, we don't need that," and that Nintendo's philosophy being that their platform exists for their own first-party games, and if third-party developers also wish to make games on it, they would go, "Okay, you can do it." And if they don't want to do it, then they go, "We don't want you." It was clear a major bridge had been burnt. What was once a very strong tide that started back on the NES, that in fact practically saved them with their first Final Fantasy game, was now gone. In exchange, they could finally create the unhindered vision they had with a long game featuring FMV cutscenes and cinematic battles with high polygonal models. It was an exchange that was well worth the sacrifice. Chapter 4: High Payoff and Bad Blood. And so Final Fantasy VII released on January 31st, 1997 in Japan and September 7th, 1997 in North America for the Sony PlayStation, with all that Sakaguchi and the team had wished for being fulfilled. They had made their first 3D Final Fantasy game and it succeeded with flying colors. Not only was it a success in Japan as per Final Fantasy tradition, but there was massive hype for its release that led to the PlayStation being sold out across Japan leading up to the game's release. It sold over 2 million copies in only 2 days for what was an audience of 4 million PlayStation owners at the time, a very high attach rate as such. However, it was not just a success in Japan, but also for the first time ever, the game sold tremendously well in the West, with it being one of the most anticipated games in North America at the time, something that was never achieved with Final Fantasy on Nintendo consoles up to then. The game's demand led to it selling 330,000 copies during its opening weekend, which even defeated Star Fox 64's impressive numbers of 300,000 copies at the time. This one game was what finally broke the constant dominance of Nintendo in North America, with the PlayStation finally outselling the Nintendo 64, a system seller, a clear killer app that finally set the PlayStation on a much higher plane than the Nintendo 64 worldwide. Nintendo had indeed failed grandly in securing the game with their very decision to stick to cartridges, on top of also having odd hardware that they couldn't work with, and this had cost them dearly. In fact, President Yamauchi was still furious at the situation at hand, that even years later in 1999, he would comment that people who play RPGs are depressed gamers who like to sit alone in their dark rooms and play slow games, with the slow games clearly referring to RPGs, which the N64 sorely lacked. And this bad blood would stay between Squaresoft and Nintendo for years to come, with following entries constantly only appearing on Sony platforms for a long time. Epilogue: The Reunion. While Final Fantasy VII did cause a rift between Square and Nintendo, the relationship between the companies did slowly repair over time, with new president of Nintendo Satoru Iwata stepping in to repair ties with many third-party developers. As such, Squaresoft started to bring their old 2D Final Fantasies to the Game Boy Advance, and even a new Final Fantasy Tactics game for the system. But on top of that, even a new spin-off Final Fantasy game dubbed Crystal Chronicles appeared on the home console, the GameCube. And over time, more and more games started to be developed for Nintendo platforms again, and to an extent, Xbox consoles would be mainly getting the mainline entries, but at the same time, relations were improving between the two companies, and eventually with the Nintendo Switch, saw many of these games that Nintendo never got after Final Fantasy VI appear on their console, from the critically acclaimed titles such as 10, 12, 9, 8, and yes, even Final Fantasy VII finally appearing on a Nintendo console at long last. In fact, the remake of Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII was released as a multi-platform release, including for the Nintendo Switch, showcasing that despite everything, the companies are finally on good terms once more.